You know that saying about how your wife running off with your dad means you're about to make sure they'll both die broken alone? Yeah, me neither, because nobody talks about this shit until it happens to you. But here I am, living proof that sometimes life writes jokes so dark they circle back to being fucking hilarious. 3 months ago, I thought I had it figured out. Decent job at the accounting firm, nice little house in the suburbs, wife who still laughed at my terrible dad jokes. Sarah and I had been married for 8 years, and sure, things weren't exactly fireworks anymore, but I figured that was normal. We were comfortable, stable. All those words people use when they're trying to convince themselves that boring equals good. My old man Frank had been coming around more often since Mom died 2 years back. Made sense. Guy was lonely, needed family around. I actually felt good about it, you know? Like I was being a decent son, making sure he wasn't sitting alone in that empty house talking to Mom's pictures. Sarah seemed to enjoy his company too, always asking when he'd be over for dinner, making his favorite pot roast, laughing at his stories about the good old days when men were men and credit scores actually mattered. God, I was such a fucking idiot. The universe has this twisted sense of humor about timing. You'd think if your wife was going to destroy your entire world, she'd at least have the courtesy to do it on a normal Tuesday or something. But no, I had to find out on my birthday. Because apparently life decided I needed a present that would keep on giving. And by giving, I mean repeatedly kicking me in the balls every time I thought about it. I came home early from work, had this brilliant idea to surprise Sarah, maybe take her out for a nice dinner, get a little birthday action later. The kind of suburban romance that keeps marriages limping along for decades. I pulled into the driveway and noticed Dad's beat-up Chevy parked on the street. Nothing weird about that. He practically lived at our place on weekends. But something felt off the second I opened the front door. The house was too quiet. Not normal quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl because your brain is picking up on something your conscious mind hasn't figured out yet. I called out Sarah's name, got nothing back. Called for Dad. Still nothing. I should have left. Should have turned around, gotten back in my car, and driven until I hit an ocean or a mountain or another fucking planet. But you know how it is. When your gut is screaming at you to run, there's this masochistic part of your brain that absolutely has to know why. So I walked toward our bedroom. Each step felt like wading through concrete. My heart was doing this weird skippy thing, like it was trying to escape my chest before my brain caught up with what was happening. The hardwood floor creaked under my feet. The same creak that used to annoy me when Sarah would get up for water in the middle of the night, except now it sounded like a fucking death march. The bedroom door was closed. In 8 years of marriage, we never closed the bedroom door during the day unless we were doing things that required privacy. I stood there for what felt like an hour but was probably 30 seconds, hand hovering over the doorknob like it might be electrified. My palms were sweating, and I had this metallic taste in my mouth that I now know was pure, concentrated dread. When I finally turned that handle, the universe took whatever remained of my faith in basic human decency and fed it through a wood chipper. My wife, my fucking wife, was naked and wrapped around my father like she was trying to absorb him through her pores. They were so lost in their own little world of betrayal that they didn't even notice me standing there, watching my entire life implode in real time. I think I made some kind of sound. Not a word, just this strangled noise that comes from somewhere deep in your chest when your brain short circuits. That's when they finally looked up. Sarah's face went through this rapid-fire series of expressions: surprise, guilt, defiance, and then something that looked almost like relief. Like she'd been carrying this secret around for so long that getting caught was actually a fucking blessing. Dad just looked annoyed. Not ashamed, not apologetic, annoyed. Like I was interrupting something important instead of witnessing the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band about to snap. I remember thinking, in some distant corner of my mind that was still functioning, that this was the kind of moment they write country songs about. Except those songs usually end with someone getting shot or driving their truck into a lake, and I was just standing there like a mannequin, trying to process what I was seeing. Sarah finally spoke, and her voice had this casual tone that made everything 10 times worse. She didn't sound guilty or ashamed or even particularly surprised. She sounded inconvenienced. She told me it wasn't what it looked like, which would have been funny if I wasn't busy having what I'm pretty sure was a mild heart attack. Because unless what it looked like was my wife fucking my father in our bed on my birthday, I'm pretty sure it was exactly what it looked like. Dad cleared his throat. Actually fucking cleared his throat like he was about to give a presentation at a board meeting and said they needed to talk to me. That they'd been meaning to have this conversation for a while now. This conversation, like they'd been planning this moment, workshopping it, maybe even practicing their lines in the mirror. The casual way he said it, the complete lack of shame or acknowledgement that he'd just blown up his son's marriage, it hit me harder than seeing them together in the first place. I backed out of the room. Didn't run, didn't scream, didn't throw punches or start breaking furniture. Just backed away like I was retreating from a wild animal. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grab the doorframe. Sarah called my name, told me to wait, to let them explain. Her voice had this patronizing edge to it, like she was talking to a child who'd walked in on something they weren't supposed to see, which I guess is exactly what happened. I made it to the kitchen before my legs gave out, ended up sitting on the floor with my back against the refrigerator, staring at the stupid motivational magnet Sarah had bought that said, "Today is the first day of the rest of your life." The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. My phone was buzzing in my pocket. Text messages, probably from work wondering where I'd disappeared to. Normal life trying to intrude on the apocalypse happening in my living room. I thought about answering, about pretending this was all just some nightmare I'd wake up from, but I could hear them moving around upstairs, their voices carrying down through the vents, and I knew this was as real as it gets. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was how planned it all felt. This wasn't some spontaneous moment of weakness or a one-time mistake. The way they looked at each other, the easy intimacy between them, the complete lack of surprise when I walked in. This had been going on for a while. Maybe months, maybe longer. While I was working late to pay for Sarah's yoga classes and Dad's medications, they were here, in my house, in my bed, planning whatever future they thought they were going to have together. I sat on that kitchen floor until the sun started setting, listening to them get dressed and whisper to each other like co-conspirators. And somewhere between the anger and the hurt and the complete fucking bewilderment, something cold and calculating started forming in the back of my mind. They thought they'd won something, thought they'd gotten away with the perfect crime, that I'd just roll over and accept whatever scraps of explanation they decided to throw my way. They had no idea what they just started. By the time they finally came downstairs, I'd moved from the kitchen floor to the couch, because sitting on linoleum while your life falls apart just feels pathetic. They walked in together, fucking together, like they were presenting a united front at a PTA meeting instead of explaining why they'd decided to nuke my existence from orbit. Sarah had put on her serious conversation outfit, that blue sweater she wore when she wanted to look responsible and trustworthy. Dad was wearing his good jeans, the ones without paint stains. They'd actually gotten dressed up to destroy my life. The attention to detail was almost impressive. They sat across from me on the love seat, because of course they did. And Sarah started talking in that voice she used when she was trying to manage me. Calm, reasonable, like she was explaining why we couldn't afford a vacation this year, instead of why she'd been bouncing on my father's dick in our marital bed. She told me they hadn't planned for this to happen. It just developed naturally over time. They'd found a real connection, something deeper than what she and I had. They were in love, and they hoped I could understand and maybe even be happy for them. Happy for them. I actually laughed. Not a bitter laugh or a sarcastic one, just pure, amazed laughter at the sheer fucking audacity. Sarah's face pinched up like she'd tasted something sour, and she asked what was so funny. I told her I was just admiring the presentation. The matching outfits, the united front, the carefully rehearsed speech about natural development and real connection. Very professional. They could probably package this whole approach and sell it to other cheating spouses. Dad finally spoke up, and his voice had this defensive edge that I recognized from when I was a kid, and he'd gotten caught doing something Mom disapproved of. He said this wasn't how they wanted me to find out, but since it had happened this way, we might as well be adults about it. Adults about it. Coming from a 72-year-old man who was fucking his son's wife, that was rich. I asked him how long this adult behavior had been going on. The question hung there like a bad smell while they exchanged one of those looks that couples share when they're trying to decide how much truth they can get away with. Sarah finally admitted it had been about 6 months. 6 months of family dinners where I'd sat there like a fucking idiot, grateful that my wife and dad were getting along so well. 6 months of me working overtime to afford the little extras that made our life comfortable, while they were upstairs exploring their natural connection. 6 months of Dad giving me advice about marriage and Sarah asking when he'd be coming over for dinner. The timeline was making my skin crawl. I started thinking about all the times Sarah had been distant, all the excuses about working late or meeting friends, all the times Dad had mysteriously been unavailable when I called, or had weird explanations for why he couldn't stick around after dinner. The signs had been there, painted in neon fucking letters, and I'd missed every single one because I'd been too busy being a trusting husband and son. They kept talking, explaining their plans like they were discussing a business merger. Sarah was going to move in with Dad. They'd been looking at places together. Apparently, my birthday hadn't been the only thing they'd been planning behind my back. Dad would sell his house, Sarah would file for divorce, and they'd start fresh somewhere new. Maybe Florida, where the weather was nice and the cost of living was reasonable. They had it all figured out. Every detail planned, every obstacle considered. Except for one thing. They'd fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. See, here's what Sarah and Dad didn't know about me. I'm really, really good at my job. And my job is finding money that people are trying to hide. I spend my days tracking down assets that cheating spouses and crooked business partners think they've tucked away where nobody can find them. I know every trick, every loophole, every creative way people try to move money around when they don't want it discovered in divorce proceedings. I also know how to make money disappear. While they were explaining their beautiful future together, I was already mentally cataloging every financial vulnerability they had. Dad's pension, his Social Security, the equity in his house, his modest investment portfolio, all of it managed through accounts and institutions where I happened to have professional relationships. Sarah's teacher retirement fund, her small inheritance from her grandmother, even the joint accounts she thought she understood. Every single asset they were counting on for their happy ending. They finished their presentation and looked at me expectantly, like they were waiting for me to congratulate them on their honesty and wish them well in their new life together. The silence stretched out until Sarah asked what I was thinking. I told them I was thinking about logistics. Sarah perked up, probably relieved that I wasn't screaming or throwing things. She asked what kind of logistics, and I could see her mentally preparing to discuss custody schedules and property division like we were planning a vacation instead of the complete destruction of everything we'd built together. I asked Dad if he'd updated his will recently. The question caught him off guard, and he stammered something about not seeing how that was relevant. I explained that it was very relevant, actually, because if he was planning to start a new life with my soon-to-be ex-wife, he'd probably want to make sure his affairs were in order. You know, in case something happened to him. The way I said it made Sarah go very still. Dad's face got that defensive look again, and he asked what I meant by something happened. I clarified that I meant natural things, health issues, financial setbacks, the kind of problems that tend to plague older men who make poor decisions about their retirement planning. Sarah finally caught on that my calm acceptance wasn't quite what it seemed. She asked if I was threatening them, and her voice had this little tremor that told me she was starting to understand that maybe they hadn't thought this through as completely as they'd believed. I told her I wasn't threatening anyone. I was just observing that people who make dramatic life changes in their 70s often find that the world is less forgiving than they expected. Resources that seem secure can disappear overnight. Pensions can be tied up in bureaucratic red tape. Investment accounts can suffer mysterious technical difficulties that take months to resolve. Dad was looking less confident now. He asked what I was getting at, and I could see the first flicker of real concern in his eyes. For all his planning with Sarah, he'd apparently never considered that his son might not just roll over and accept being discarded. I stood up then, because sitting down for this conversation was making me feel like I was asking permission for something. I told them they'd clearly put a lot of thought into their future, and I respected that. But I'd also put some thought into a few things, and I figured they deserved to know what they were getting into. Sarah tried to interrupt, something about wanting to handle the divorce amicably, but I held up a hand. I wasn't done talking. I explained that my job involves a lot of interesting relationships with people who handle other people's money. Banks, investment firms, pension administrators, social security offices, all staffed with professionals who understand that sometimes accounts need to be frozen while investigations are conducted. Sometimes paperwork gets misfiled. Sometimes computer systems develop glitches that can take ages to repair, especially when the people experiencing those glitches have been flagged for potentially fraudulent activity. The room was getting very quiet. Sarah's face had gone pale, and Dad was starting to look like he was regretting more than just getting caught. I told them about my friend Marcus at the Social Security office, who'd been dealing with a massive uptick in benefit fraud lately. How he'd mentioned that any sudden changes in living arrangements or relationship status automatically triggered review processes that could suspend payments for months while they verified that everything was legitimate. I mentioned Janet at Dad's bank, who'd been telling me horror stories about elder financial abuse cases where family members manipulated seniors into making poor financial decisions. How banks were getting really aggressive about freezing accounts when they suspected that kind of manipulation, especially when large amounts of money were being moved around by people who didn't usually handle their own finances. Sarah asked what the fuck I was doing, and there was real panic in her voice now. She was starting to understand that her carefully planned escape route might have some unexpected roadblocks. I told her I wasn't doing anything yet. I was just sharing some interesting information I'd learned in my professional capacity. For instance, did they know that teacher pension funds could be suspended during divorce proceedings if there was any suspicion of asset concealment? Or that mortgage companies could call in loans immediately if they discovered that the property owners had made false statements about their living arrangements or relationship status? Dad was looking sick now. He asked if I was really going to destroy him financially just because I was angry about Sarah. His voice had this wounded tone, like I was being unreasonable instead of responding to being completely fucked over by the two people I trusted most. I sat back down and looked at both of them for a long moment. Then I told them the truth. I wasn't angry about Sarah. I was angry about the lying, the planning, the months of deception while I'd worked my ass off to support them both, the casual way they'd expected me to just accept their betrayal and wish them well in their new life built on the ruins of mine. But mostly I was angry about the arrogance. They'd assumed I was weak, assumed I'd be hurt and confused and too devastated to fight back. They'd counted on me being the same trusting idiot who'd spent 6 months financing his own humiliation without even noticing. They'd made their plans based on the assumption that I'd just disappear quietly and let them enjoy the fruits of their betrayal. Sarah tried to speak, but I wasn't finished. I explained that they had a choice. They could continue with their beautiful romance, but they'd do it with exactly the resources they'd earned through their own honest work. No pension money that came from decades of Dad relying on family support. No teacher retirement benefits that were partially funded by the marital assets I'd contributed to. No proceeds from selling a house that I'd helped maintain and improve. No joint accounts that existed because of my income and credit history. If they wanted to be together, they could do it broke. Or they could reconsider their priorities, and maybe we could work something out that didn't involve scorched earth financial warfare. Dad could go back to his house and his normal life. Sarah could move out quietly and we could handle the divorce like civilized people. Everyone could walk away with their financial dignity intact. The silence that followed was absolutely beautiful. You could practically hear the gears turning in their heads as they started to realize just how many of their assets were vulnerable to the kind of bureaucratic nightmares I could orchestrate without ever technically breaking any laws. Dad was the first to crack. He asked what kind of timeline I was talking about for making these problems go away, and I could see Sarah glaring at him like he was already giving up on their grand romance. I told him that was an interesting question. How long did it usually take to restore someone's financial standing after they'd been flagged for suspicious activity? Months, typically. Sometimes years, especially if there were multiple agencies involved, and the paperwork kept getting complicated by new irregularities that mysteriously surfaced during the investigation process. Sarah stood up abruptly and accused me of blackmail. Her voice was shrill now, and she looked like she was finally grasping that her carefully orchestrated escape plan might not be as foolproof as she'd thought. I corrected her. Blackmail would be threatening to expose something they wanted kept secret in exchange for money or favors. What I was describing was just the natural consequences of the choices they'd made. When people in their position made dramatic life changes, these kinds of complications were inevitable. I was just helping them understand what they should expect. They could make whatever choices they wanted, but they should probably factor in the realistic costs of those choices, including the bureaucratic hassles that tend to plague people who fit certain demographic and behavioral profiles. Dad sat back down heavily and put his head in his hands. Sarah was still standing, but she looked less defiant and more calculating. I could see her running the numbers, trying to figure out if their love was worth potentially losing everything they'd worked for their entire lives. The beautiful thing about financial pressure is that it doesn't require grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It just sits there, grinding away at people's options until they start making different choices all by themselves. And unlike emotional manipulation or physical threats, There's nothing obviously wrong with simply making sure people understand the full implications of their decisions. I stood up and told them they didn't need to decide anything right now. They should take some time to think about what kind of future they really wanted and what they were willing to sacrifice to get it. I'd be staying in a hotel for a few days while they figured things out. As I headed toward the door, Sarah called after me. She asked how I could be so cold about this, how I could turn something emotional into a financial transaction. I turned back and looked at her, really looked at her, for what I knew would probably be the last time I'd see her as my wife instead of my opponent. I told her she'd made it a transaction the moment she'd started planning her exit strategy while still living off my income and fucking my father in my bed. She'd reduced our 8-year marriage to a business arrangement the second she'd decided that my feelings and my future were less important than her new relationship. I was just speaking her language. The next few days were going to be very educational for both of them. The hotel room I'd booked for the week was one of those extended stay places with a kitchenette and a desk, because I had work to do. Real work. The kind that requires spreadsheets, phone calls, and a level of focused attention that's hard to maintain when you're sleeping in the same house as the people who've just blown up your life. I'd brought my laptop, my phone, and a legal pad that I'd filled with notes during our little family meeting, names, account numbers, institutions, timelines. Everything I'd need to turn their beautiful romance into a financial catastrophe that would make the 2008 housing crisis look like a minor inconvenience. The first call I made was to Marcus at Social Security. We'd worked together on a few cases where people had been collecting benefits while living in situations that technically violated the program requirements. Marcus was one of those government employees who actually gave a shit about doing his job right, which made him very useful when you needed someone to pay attention to irregularities that might otherwise slip through the cracks. I explained that I was concerned about my father's living situation. He was 72, recently widowed, and I'd noticed some signs that he might be in a relationship that could affect his benefit status. Nothing dramatic, just some changes in his spending patterns and living arrangements that seemed worth investigating. Marcus took down Dad's information and assured me that they'd look into it. Standard procedure, he said. Anytime there were questions about a beneficiary's circumstances, they'd suspend payments pending a full review. The beauty of bureaucracy is that once it starts moving, it's almost impossible to stop. Dad's Social Security payments, his primary source of income, would be frozen within a week while they investigated whether his new living arrangements constituted a change that needed to be reported. The investigation could take months, especially if the paperwork kept getting delayed by additional questions that mysteriously arose during the review process. Next, I called Janet at First National, where Dad had been banking for 30 years. Janet handled elder financial abuse cases, and she'd seen enough family manipulation to be suspicious of any sudden changes in an elderly person's financial behavior. I mentioned that I was worried about Dad. He'd been acting differently since Mom died, more impulsive, and I'd noticed he'd been talking about making some major financial decisions that seemed out of character. Nothing specific, just a son's concern that maybe someone was taking advantage of his grief. Janet appreciated the heads up. She'd flagged Dad's account for any unusual activity. Large withdrawals, changes to beneficiaries, attempts to restructure his mortgage or access his home equity. If anything looked suspicious, they'd freeze the account immediately and require him to come in with documentation proving that any financial decisions were made without coercion. Given his age and recent loss, they'd err on the side of caution. The pension fund was next. Dad had worked for the city for 40 years, and his pension was administered through a company that took fiduciary responsibility very seriously. I'd handled cases involving pension fraud before, and I knew they had protocols for investigating any situation where a beneficiary's circumstances changed in ways that might affect their eligibility or indicate potential abuse. I called their fraud hotline and explained that I was concerned about my father's financial decision-making since Mom's death. He'd been talking about major life changes, possibly including relocating and restructuring his living situation in ways that might affect his pension status. I wasn't sure if he understood the implications, and I wanted to make sure someone could review his situation before he made any irreversible decisions. The pension fund took this kind of thing seriously. They'd freeze Dad's monthly payments immediately and require him to come in for an interview to verify that any life changes were legitimate and that he understood how they might affect his benefits. The process could take weeks, maybe months if there were complications or if additional documentation was required. By the end of the first day, I'd made 14 phone calls and sent 6 emails. Dad's income was about to drop from roughly $4,000 a month to zero, and every attempt he made to access his money would trigger additional reviews that would extend the timeline indefinitely. But I was just getting started. Sarah's situation required a more delicate touch, but it was also more vulnerable. Teacher retirement benefits are administered through state agencies that have strict rules about asset disclosure during divorce proceedings. Any attempt to conceal marital assets or any indication that a spouse was trying to manipulate the system could result in benefit suspension pending a full audit. I reached out to my contact at the state teacher retirement system and explained that I was going through a divorce and wanted to make sure everything was handled properly. My wife was a teacher, and I discovered that she'd been making some financial decisions without my knowledge. Nothing necessarily illegal, but I wanted to ensure that all marital assets were properly disclosed and that there wasn't any attempt to hide money that should be part of the divorce settlement. The retirement system took this very seriously. They'd freeze Sarah's account immediately and require both of us to provide detailed financial statements before any benefits could be released. Any discrepancies, like unexplained changes in living arrangements or new financial relationships, would trigger extended investigations that could take months to resolve. But the really beautiful part was Sarah's credit. See, our credit cards, our mortgage, our car loans. Everything was intertwined after 8 years of marriage. And when someone's financial circumstances change dramatically, especially when those changes involve potential fraud or deception, credit companies have a responsibility to protect themselves. I started making calls, not to report anything false, that would be illegal, but to inform our creditors about the changing family situation and to request that they review our accounts for any irregularities. The mortgage company, the credit card companies, even the car loan administrator, all of them had protocols for situations where a borrower's circumstances changed in ways that might affect their ability to pay. By the second day, Sarah was starting to discover that her credit cards weren't working. Not because I'd canceled them, but because the companies had frozen them pending reviews of our changed financial status. Her teacher salary was decent, but it wasn't enough to cover the bills for a house that had been budgeted based on 2 incomes. The mortgage payment alone would eat up most of her monthly take-home pay. The phone started ringing on Wednesday. Sarah first, her voice tight with panic, asking what the fuck I'd done to their accounts. I explained that I hadn't done anything to their accounts. I'd simply made sure that the relevant institutions were aware of the changing family circumstances so they could adjust their risk assessments accordingly. Standard procedure during divorce proceedings. Dad called 2 hours later. Social Security had suspended his benefits pending a review of his living situation. His bank had frozen his checking account after flagging unusual activity patterns. His pension fund wanted him to come in for an interview before they could process his next payment. He wanted to know what was happening, and his voice had a tremor that hadn't been there during our kitchen table discussion. I told him what I told Sarah, that when people make major life changes, especially changes that involve potential financial risk to institutions that have been supporting them, those institutions naturally want to verify that everything is legitimate. The reviews were standard procedure. Nothing to worry about, assuming everything was above board. But here's where the beautiful cruelty of bureaucracy really shines. Once these processes start, they take on a life of their own. Even if I wanted to stop them, which I absolutely didn't, there was no magic button to press that would make the reviews go away. Each institution had its own protocols, its own timeline, its own requirements for documentation and verification, and each review created paperwork that triggered additional reviews at other institutions. Dad's frozen bank account meant he couldn't make his mortgage payment, which triggered a review by his mortgage company, which discovered the Social Security investigation, which prompted them to flag his account for potential fraud. Sarah's suspended retirement benefits meant she couldn't demonstrate stable income for her credit applications, which meant she couldn't qualify for the loans she'd need to maintain her current lifestyle while the other investigations were ongoing. It was like watching dominoes fall, except each domino was a critical piece of their financial infrastructure. And I'd spent 2 days carefully arranging them so that each collapse would trigger the next one. By Friday, they were both calling me multiple times a day. The panic in their voices was music to my ears. Not because I enjoyed their suffering, but because I enjoyed their sudden understanding that actions have consequences, and that fucking over someone who handles financial investigations for a living might not have been their smartest move. Sarah left a voicemail that was half pleading, half threatening. She accused me of destroying their lives out of spite, of using my professional connections to abuse the system, of being vindictive and cruel. She demanded that I fix whatever I'd done and threatened to file complaints against me with my employer and various professional organizations. The beautiful irony was that I hadn't actually done anything unethical. Every call I'd made, every concern I'd raised, every review I'd requested was completely legitimate and within my rights as both a concerned family member and a spouse going through divorce proceedings. I'd simply been very thorough in making sure that all the relevant institutions were aware of the changing circumstances that might affect their risk exposure. Dad's voicemail was different. He sounded older, frailer, like the reality of his situation was finally sinking in. He asked me to call him back, said we needed to talk, that maybe they'd been hasty in their planning. The confidence from our kitchen table meeting was completely gone, replaced by the voice of a 72-year-old man who was suddenly facing the prospect of having no income and no access to his savings. I let them sweat through the weekend. Monday morning, I got the call I'd been expecting. Sarah, her voice barely above a whisper, asking if we could meet. She said they needed to talk, that maybe there was a way to work things out that would be better for everyone. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the desperate pragmatism of someone who just discovered that love doesn't pay the bills when your credit cards are frozen and your income has disappeared. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, where they couldn't ambush me with emotional appeals in the same bedroom where I discovered their betrayal. They both looked like hell. Dad had aged a decade in a week, and Sarah had that hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping. They sat across from me like supplicants, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like I was back in control. Dad spoke first, his voice careful and measured. He said they'd been thinking about what I'd said, about the complications their relationship might cause. Maybe they'd been too hasty in their planning. Maybe there was a way to handle things that would be less disruptive for everyone involved. Sarah nodded along, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She wasn't here because she'd suddenly realized the error of her ways. She was here because their beautiful romance had collided with financial reality and lost. Hard to maintain passionate love when you can't afford groceries. I told them I appreciated their willingness to reconsider. The various investigations and reviews that had been triggered by their sudden lifestyle changes would take months to resolve. But there might be ways to expedite the process if they could demonstrate that the changes weren't as dramatic as they'd initially appeared. Dad asked what I meant by that, and I could see hope flickering in his eyes, probably envisioning a scenario where he could keep his income and his dignity while still maintaining some version of his relationship with Sarah. I explained that the various agencies were concerned about elder abuse and asset concealment. If they could demonstrate that Dad wasn't being manipulated and that there wasn't any attempt to hide marital assets, the reviews might be resolved more quickly. But that would require some significant changes to their current plans. Dad would need to return to his own home and maintain his normal living arrangements. Sarah would need to remain in our house and maintain the appearance of a stable marriage while we worked through divorce proceedings slowly and carefully with full financial transparency. Any relationship between them would need to be completely severed, at least publicly, until all the investigations were concluded. The silence that followed was beautiful. I could see them trying to figure out if there was some way to game the system, some middle ground that would let them maintain their relationship while still getting their money back. But bureaucracy doesn't negotiate, and I'd made sure that any deviation from complete separation would trigger additional scrutiny that would extend their financial exile indefinitely. Sarah finally asked how long this would take, and her voice was barely audible. She was starting to understand that their great romance was going to cost them everything they'd worked for their entire lives. I told them it was hard to say. These things could take months under the best circumstances, maybe years if there were complications. The important thing was that everyone needed to appear completely committed to maintaining their previous arrangements until the reviews were concluded. Any sign that they were still trying to manipulate the system would restart the entire process. Dad asked if I was going to keep living in the hotel, and I could see him mentally calculating whether he could afford to keep paying for Sarah's expenses while his own income was frozen. The math wasn't working out in his favor. I told them that was another complication. If I moved back home, it would help demonstrate that we were committed to maintaining stable family arrangements while the various agencies conducted their reviews. It might even speed up the process, since investigators preferred to see families working together rather than fracturing during stressful periods. The trap was closing around them, and they both knew it. They could continue their relationship and accept financial ruin, or they could end it and maybe get their lives back to something resembling normal. But they couldn't have both. Sarah excused herself to go to the bathroom, and I watched her walk away with that careful composure of someone who was falling apart inside but couldn't afford to show it. Dad sat across from me, looking like he'd been carved out of granite. He told me he was sorry, not for the affair. He couldn't quite bring himself to apologize for that, but for the way it had happened, for letting me find out the way I did, for not handling things better. I told him I appreciated that, but apologies weren't going to fix the bureaucratic mess that had been triggered by their choices. The various agencies had their own procedures and timelines, and personal feelings didn't factor into government efficiency. When Sarah came back, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. She asked what would happen if they agreed to end their relationship and return to their previous arrangements. How long before their finances were restored, and what guarantees did they have that I wouldn't just trigger new investigations once they were back on stable ground? I explained that I couldn't offer guarantees about bureaucratic timelines, but I could promise that I wouldn't initiate any new concerns as long as they maintained appropriate boundaries. The investigations would run their natural course, and assuming everything checked out, their benefits and accounts would be restored eventually. But there was one more thing we needed to discuss. The divorce was still happening. That hadn't changed. I couldn't continue being married to someone who'd betrayed me so completely, and I wasn't interested in pretending everything was fine just to make their lives easier. The question was whether we handled it quietly and amicably, or whether it became a protracted battle that would inevitably involve more financial scrutiny and asset discovery. Sarah's face went pale. She asked what I wanted, and I could see her bracing for demands that would punish her beyond just ending her relationship with Dad. I told her I wanted exactly what I deserved from the beginning: honesty, respect, and a fair settlement that didn't involve her trying to hide assets or manipulate the process. The house, the cars, the retirement accounts, everything would be divided according to state law, with full disclosure and no attempts to game the system. Dad would return to his home and his normal life. Sarah would file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. They would have no contact with each other during the divorce proceedings, or for at least a year afterward. If they wanted to resume their relationship after that, when all the investigations were closed and the divorce was finalized, that was their business. But they'd do it starting from zero, with whatever resources they had left after paying for their individual lives during the separation period. The math was brutal, and they both knew it. Dad was burning through his savings to cover his expenses while his income was frozen. Sarah couldn't afford the mortgage on her teacher salary alone, and she'd have to find somewhere else to live once the house was sold. By the time they were free to be together, they'd both be essentially broke, starting over in their 70s and 50s respectively. They looked at each other across the coffee shop table, and I could see the moment when their grand romance ran headfirst into financial reality and lost. Love might conquer all, but it doesn't pay for prescription medications or mortgage payments or the 1,000 other expenses that keep life functioning. Dad was the first to break. He told Sarah he was sorry, but he couldn't afford to lose everything he'd worked for his entire life. He needed his pension, his Social Security, his house. He couldn't risk financial ruin for a relationship that was probably doomed anyway, given the circumstances. Sarah sat there in stunned silence for a long moment. Then she asked me if I was satisfied, if this was the revenge I'd been planning, if destroying their happiness was worth all the effort I'd put into orchestrating their financial collapse. I told her the truth. This wasn't about revenge. It was about consequences. They'd made choices based on the assumption that I was weak, that I'd just accept their betrayal and disappear quietly. They'd planned their future using resources they'd only been able to accumulate because of the family structure they were destroying. They'd counted on being able to hurt me without any cost to themselves. I'd simply made sure they understood the real price of their decisions. If their relationship couldn't survive basic financial pressure, then it probably wasn't the great love story they'd convinced themselves it was. They agreed to my terms that afternoon. Not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't afford not to. Dad would go home and pretend none of this had ever happened. Sarah would file for divorce and move out quietly once we'd sorted through the legal requirements. They'd both spend the next year trying to rebuild the financial security they'd thrown away for 6 months of sneaking around like teenagers. The beautiful part was that I'd accomplished everything without actually breaking any rules. Every agency that had frozen their assets and suspended their benefits was following standard procedures. Every investigation I triggered was legitimate and justified. I'd simply been very thorough in making sure that all the relevant institutions understood the changing circumstances that might affect their risk exposure. As I walked back to my hotel that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: satisfaction. Not the cheap thrill of watching someone suffer, but the deep contentment that comes from seeing justice actually work. They'd betrayed me because they thought they could get away with it. They'd planned their future on the assumption that I'd be too hurt and confused to fight back effectively. They'd been wrong about both things. The divorce proceedings started the following week, and Sarah moved out 2 months later. Dad's benefits were restored after a 6-week review that concluded with a finding of no fraud, but strongly recommended that he be more careful about his living arrangements and financial decision-making in the future. By the time everything was settled, they'd both learned an expensive lesson about the difference between love and lust, and about the hidden costs of betraying someone who knows how money actually works. They never did get back together. 2 years later, I'm sitting in my new apartment, smaller than the house, but it's mine, and nobody's fucking my father in the bedroom, reading a Facebook post that Sarah's sister tagged me in by accident. Sarah's working at a different school district now, something about needing a fresh start, and she's living in a studio apartment across town that costs more per month than our old mortgage payment. The post is one of those inspirational things about how sometimes life forces you to start over, and how that can be a blessing in disguise. I screenshot it and add it to the folder on my desktop labeled Karma Updates, because apparently I'm petty enough to document the long-term consequences of their choices, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Dad and I don't talk much anymore. We exchange Christmas cards and awkward phone calls on birthdays, but the easy relationship we used to have died in that bedroom along with my marriage. He's still living in his house, still collecting his pension and Social Security, but something fundamental shifted when he realized that actions have consequences even when you're 72 years old. Last I heard, he was dating a widow from his church, someone age-appropriate who has her own retirement savings and doesn't come with a son who specializes in financial investigations. The divorce was finalized 18 months ago, and it was exactly as clean and fair as I'd promised it would be. Sarah got her half of everything, which turned out to be significantly less than she'd expected once we factored in the legal fees and the drop in property values. I kept the retirement accounts I'd built through my job, she kept hers from teaching, and we split the proceeds from selling the house after the mortgage was paid off. She tried to contest the division once, claiming that I'd manipulated the system to artificially depress our assets. Her lawyer filed a motion alleging that my actions during the separation period had constituted financial abuse designed to reduce her settlement. The judge threw it out after I provided documentation showing that every agency investigation had been legitimate and that the asset freezes had been standard procedure for the circumstances involved. Turns out, my husband made sure the government agencies actually did their jobs. Isn't recognized as grounds for increasing your divorce settlement. The best part, and I mean this sincerely, is that I'm actually happier now than I was before any of this happened. Not because of some bullshit about how betrayal made me stronger, or how I learned to love myself, or whatever self-help garbage people spout when their lives fall apart. I'm happier because I discovered something important about myself. I'm really fucking good at strategic thinking when someone pisses me off enough. My job got more interesting after word got around about how I'd handled my personal situation. Turns out there's a growing market for forensic accountants who understand both the technical aspects of financial investigation and the psychological aspects of how people make terrible decisions with money. I've consulted on 3 major divorce cases and 2 corporate fraud investigations in the past year, and my reputation for thoroughness has made me very popular with lawyers who represent clients going through contentious asset divisions. I bought a new car last month. Nothing fancy, but it's mine, and I didn't have to consult with anyone about the color or the financing terms. I've been dating someone for about 6 months now, a woman named Lisa who works in IT and has never met my father. She knows the basic outline of what happened with Sarah and Dad, but I've spared her the detailed breakdown of exactly how I orchestrated their financial collapse. Some stories are better saved for internet strangers who appreciate the craftsmanship involved. Lisa asked me once if I ever regret how I handled things, if I think I went too far, or if I wish I'd been more forgiving. It's a fair question, and I've thought about it a lot during the quiet moments when you're forced to confront whether you're actually a good person or just someone who's been lucky enough not to get caught being terrible. Here's what I've concluded. I don't regret protecting myself. I don't regret making sure that people who betrayed me couldn't profit from that betrayal. I don't regret using every legal tool at my disposal to ensure that their choices had real consequences instead of just emotional ones. What I do regret is that it was necessary in the first place. I regret that Sarah couldn't just ask for a divorce if she was unhappy instead of sneaking around for 6 months. I regret that Dad couldn't keep his dick in his pants, or at least find someone who wasn't married to his son. I regret that they both assumed I was weak enough that they could just steamroll over me and move on with their lives while I picked up the pieces. But mostly I regret that they forced me to become someone who could orchestrate the systematic destruction of their financial security without losing sleep over it. Because the truth is, I didn't lose sleep over it. I slept better during those weeks of phone calls and paperwork than I had in months of marriage to someone who was actively deceiving me. That probably says something about my character that isn't entirely flattering. But it also says something about the character of people who mistake kindness for weakness and trust for stupidity. Sarah sent me a message about 6 months ago through LinkedIn, of all places. Professional networking site, very appropriate for reaching out to your ex-husband who nuked your retirement fund. She said she'd been thinking about everything that happened, and she wanted me to know that she understood why I'd reacted the way I did. She said she hoped I was doing well, and that maybe someday we could talk about things without all the anger and hurt. I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Not because I was still angry. Anger requires caring about someone, and I'd successfully trained myself not to care about Sarah anymore. I deleted it because there was nothing to discuss. She'd made her choices, I'd made mine, and we'd both lived with the consequences. There's no version of a conversation between us that ends with meaningful closure, or mutual understanding, or any of that therapeutic bullshit people think they need. Some betrayals are clean breaks. Some relationships end definitively, without the possibility of redemption or forgiveness, or even basic civility. And sometimes that's actually the healthiest outcome for everyone involved. I've learned that revenge, when done properly, isn't about making people suffer. It's about making sure that choices have appropriate consequences. Sarah and Dad didn't suffer because I'm cruel. They suffered because they made decisions that had predictable costs, and I made sure those costs couldn't be externalized onto me. They wanted to start a new life together, using resources they'd only been able to accumulate because of the relationships they were destroying. I simply ensured that their new life would be funded exclusively by their own individual efforts, without any subsidies from the people they'd betrayed. That's not revenge, that's just accounting. And if there's one thing I'm really good at, it's making sure the books balance. So yeah, my wife ran off with my dad, and I made sure they'd both die broke and alone. Well, broke anyway. Whether they die alone is up to them, but given their demonstrated judgment in romantic relationships, I'm not optimistic about their prospects. Meanwhile, I'm doing just fine. Better than fine, actually. I've got a job I'm good at, a girlfriend who doesn't know my father, and an apartment where I can watch Netflix without wondering who's fucking whom behind my back. Sometimes the good guys win, and sometimes the good guys are just the ones who are better at playing the game when someone forces them to fight dirty. Sweet dreams, Sarah and Dad. Hope it was worth it.